Good morning, good afternoon and good evening to everybody. I'm not sure where everybody's phoning in from, so I've covered all angles. On behalf of Zurich, firstly, I just want to say how proud we are of the long-term partnership that we have with RIMS and our continued involvement with them. A key component of the strategy at Zurich is around us getting closer to our customers and getting a deeper understanding of our customers. And RIMS actively encourage this through the engagement that they drive and also the thought leadership forums that they provide. And so we're delighted to be part of that. In addition, we're also delighted to be part of what is always an excellent conference. Shame we can't all be there together in person. Next year, I think I can finally say that with a bit more confidence than I could have done in the past. But I hope today's session is firstly insightful, it's enjoyable, but really I hope it's thought-provoking. And once the presentation's over, please ask any questions that come to mind, because it's a very interesting subject. It's a wide-ranging subject, and it has many complexities, as Simon will get onto in a second. So anyway, enough from me. Let me introduce our speaker, which is Simon Pallavicini. He's one of our senior risk engineers at Zurich. Having not only been a policeman, as he was just telling us, in the past, and a loss adjuster, Simon's got 25 years experience and expert knowledge in managing risk across multiple industries. And the industry base that he's got enables him to talk with knowledge and confidence around this particular subject. So we couldn't be in safer hands. So there's no point in me carrying on talking. I'm going to hand over to the main man himself, Simon. Over to you.
Thank you, Giles, and thank you, Katie. And welcome, everyone. Welcome to the RIMS 2021 Supply Chain Resilience session. Now, this year's theme is around excellence or innovative, and can we do both? And when I was thinking about this topic and putting my thoughts around what I was going to talk to you about today, I came to realise they're not mutually exclusive. And I think for organisations to make a shift from procurement as a function to demonstrating a level of supply chain maturity, they will need to embrace both excellence in terms of risk governance and innovation in terms of technology. And so what we're going to talk through today is touch on the background, the supply chain challenges, the insurance challenges, a bit of a model around a risk management framework for elevating supply chain from that linear procurement model to supply chain risk management, and then bring in the new technologies, what are called the digital supply network. And then we'll wrap up at the end with some benefits, and you'll see what the characteristics are of mature organisations. So as I said, we're going to talk through these issues, but what we're really thinking about here is shifting procurement, creating a mature state through the organisation and elevating supply chain risk management. And we need to think about that through a couple of lenses, and I'll come to those in a moment. But if you think about any risk management strategy, it's about understanding where you are today, the status quo. It's about building out that risk management strategy with all of those elements that come into it, scaling it up, and then using the understanding that you gain from that strategy, the risk, the reward, to deliver and create value for all stakeholders throughout the supply chain. Oh, there's a slide error to start with, but we are going to look through, that's one of the problems with working remotely. We are going to look at this through three lenses to support our conversation. The digital. Now, this information comes from the Business Continuity Institute in their 2020 report. And I find some really insightful information here around the use of technology. 59% of organisations aren't using technology to fully map their supply chain. And there's a reluctance towards adopting advanced solutions in the technological space. So where does this lead us? Problems with visibility. 15% of procurement officers can report visibility into tier 2 or beyond. 30% don't analyse the full extent of their supply chain. Now, when I think about that, I look deeper into the BCI report and find out that respondents reported 65% of disruptions are in tier 2 or lower, but they're not looking there. They may be doing some assessment on their immediate supplier, the tier 1, but they're not looking deeply into their supply chain. They can't predict risk within their supply base, and only 36% of organisations reported that business continuity management is integrated into procurement from the start. Only 35% of respondents had looked at the business continuity arrangements through tier 1. When you get down to a tier 4 supplier, it's 10.1%. And I think these figures are stark, and I think they give us pause to reflect and understand that visibility and flexibility in this complex, challenging environment are key for any organisation to shift from procurement to supply chain maturity. Now, we've all seen this before. We're bombarded with it every day, the geopolitical, tariffs, trade wars, all of these other supply chain risks. And when I shared this draft presentation recently with somebody, the feedback that I got was, the only thing I remember is the turkey. And for me, that may be the key takeaway from this session. What is your organisation doing to ensure that you are not going to be left as the supply chain turkey? Because this is really complex, challenging, interconnected environment that we all live in. And I think the World Economic Forum graphically illustrates that complexity through these 5 risk categories: the economic, the geopolitical, the technological, environmental, society. And if I think about this, and I think if we all think about this, it doesn't matter whether you are a sole trader or a multinational. In some way, all of these risks in this interconnected landscape touch us all. There's no escaping it. It's complex. It's really complex, and it's really interconnected. And the question I would have is, can a siloed procurement model that's focused on price, quality, quantity, and delivery, can that siloed procurement department really manage supply chain risk for an organisation? It's focused on a cost saving. Does it even think about all of these things? I'm not sure the answer, but that's the question. So we have a very complex environment, and this is what the supply chain professionals tell us about their world. This is feedback from a survey done by an organisation called Risk Methods, a Zurich partner. Yes, service industries, as you all know, we have partners and suppliers too. It's not just about commodities. This survey graphically sums up what supply chain professionals think, and you can see all of those risk categories reflected there from the previous slide presented by the World Economic Forum. Noisy, challenging, connected, all sorts of events and thoughts reflected here. But the one that really stuck in my mind was that little box circled there in yellow: too many information, too much information if we want to be grammatically correct. But the point I make about this is it has to be the right information at the right time in a very noisy world. And that's where we will talk through how a digital solution can support an organisation to filter out that noise to get the information they need at the right time. Challenging, complex, interconnected. Now, you would have all seen this before, and this is the traditional linear procurement model. focus on cost, price, quality, and delivery, where we develop a product, we plan the production, we source the components, we manufacture it, we ship it into the warehouses, and then FedEx or DHL deliver it to my little home as I work here today. It's complex too. But what really sticks out in this is the lack of visibility. So if you think about each one of these suppliers, or the mine site, or the manufacturing site, or the distribution warehouse, they're nodes in a supply network. And what's really evident here is that transparency through all of those nodes are lacking. The two suppliers don't talk to each other. The two distribution centres don't talk to each other. It's all linear communication. So it lacks transparency. It lacks the visibility. And of course, with these sorts of situations, when you have an issue at one supplier, you have a time lag. That supplier may go down or not be able to manufacture as much as required. It takes time for that information to filter back through the manufacturing sites and then come all the way back down that chain to the second supplier. Latency, lack of visibility in this really complex world. And I will talk more about transparency. That's going to come up in a moment because it's really important for an integrated supply chain to have trust and transparency through all of the stakeholders, I should say, all of those nodes. The next problem, data from the US Census Bureau. Business doesn't hold stock or inventory. We live in this just-in-time world. Everything's online. Business doesn't want stock sitting in warehouses. That's capital not being put to good use. And it's not just about products either when we think about supply chain. The BCI does note that 46% of respondents refer to labour and services disruptions. So whilst this slide talks to industry, just think also about the fact that there are human skills shortages at the moment that we're being faced with. So all of these things come together. Now, I think the two spikes are really interesting. I can't fully explain the spike in 2020. It's a fair assumption it's related to the COVID pandemic that we're in. Maybe that's US industry ramping up its stocks of toilet paper. I don't know. I really just don't know. But I think we can assume that the spike in after 2008 is inventory being ramped up by business after that recession ended. Just two interesting points there, and I'm sure many of you would have a better view and understanding of that than I. But again, let's just go back. It's complicated, it's complex, and it's interconnected and challenging. And how does all of this play out? Well, let's have a look at one industry, the automotive industry. If you take your typical car, be it a Mercedes-Benz, for example, in this case, there's around about 11,000 components go into that motor vehicle. Only 30 to 40% of them are created or manufactured by Mercedes. The other 60%, 70% by suppliers through multiple countries, multiple business units. It's complicated. And we spoke about this with another Zurich supplier, an organisation called Target P. They're a consultant in the supply chain space. And the conversation went to, this is one of the most sophisticated supply chain models that the world has today. Possibly the only other one would be aerospace. And it's still characterised by fragmentation through that supply chain and bottleneck tracing issues. Remember I spoke earlier about the lack of visibility beyond tier one? Even this sophisticated industry struggles with that. But what we were also told was it's characterised by a lack of trust and transparency. The suppliers don't want to open their books and give the auto manufacturers information because they fear that that will be used to price bargain them or replace them. And then, of course, this industry faced other issues related to semiconductors and they were in part related to the pandemic, but we're not focusing on the pandemic today. But it's important to note you can have other issues to come in. And so I was thinking about this trust issue and how an organisation and how a supply chain needs to demonstrate trust and to be open if they really want to come into this digital network solution. And it is about reliability and competence and openness and sharing information. But it's also about benevolence, or the duty to protect each other's rights. And that's going to be hard to achieve. But that would be seen to be key if the supplier is going to open itself up to the customer. It needs to know that it's protected and it won't be used against it, the information it provides to the auto manufacturer. And of course, loyalty, knowing that each other is going to perform when times are tough. And when I was looking for information to support this, I found a really interesting comment in the Productivity Commission report that's recently been released on Australia's supply chain resilience. And it actually mentions blockchain as being a potential technological solution to building supply chain trust. Now, I don't understand blockchain, it's beyond me. I understand it's a digital ledger, but I just thought that was an interesting comment that even the Productivity Commission is thinking about trust in supply chains. Let's move on. Focus on, I would like to touch on what's known as the cascade effect. This is where an interruption cascades through and causes ripples or waves. And the example here is containers. A 6-day interruption has led to massive disruption through the maritime industry, where containers are now in short supply, and I'm sure many of you would know this. And of course, the price goes up. And ultimately, this comes back to the consumer via inflation. But when we were thinking about this example, we started to think about what's flying under your radar. The Suez Canal was foreseeable. It's closed 5 times since 1869. The Panama Canal has closed several times. These are foreseeable events. But when we're thinking about supply chain, what's flying under your radar in your organisation, that little $1 component that you might miss, yet it's critically important. And let me give you an example. The Productivity Commission's report that I just mentioned talks to long-term fire retardant use in Australia. Now, this is the pink liquid that you see coming out of the aeroplanes and the helicopters when they do their firefighting activity. And in the 2019-2020 bushfires, fire authorities started to express concerns about supply. We were using it all. And so this has been looked at by the Productivity Commission. And one of their findings was that this chemical flew under the radar in Australia because of the way it was coded through something, and I do refer to my notes here, something called the Harmonised Tariff Item Statistical Code. There's a mouthful. But because of the way this chemical was coded, it flew under the radar as an essential product for Australia. Now, here's the thing. It's made by one plant in the USA. One plant supplies the whole world with this pink liquid that we use to put out bushfires. So that's an example of something that has flown under the radar for many, many years. And again, the question for us, what's flying under your radar in this complex, really interconnected and challenging world? Let's think about the insurance challenges. This is stark. Business Continuity Institute, 3 years running, less than 15% of respondents are reporting all losses are fully insured. Supply chain losses, I should say. Let's just be clear. Now, there can be reasons for that. Could be risk appetite, people holding their own risk. Some respondents referred to taking out cover for property damage incidents only. But what about all of the other lines of business? 68% reported increased costs of working. 40% reported disruptions related to product recall. So we need to connect all of these dots when we're thinking about risk transfer, which is part of a solution to a risk management framework, part of a solution, not the whole solution. So we need to think about all of those covers that may be necessary for an organisation to protect themselves through risk transfer. Product recall, product liability, cyber, marine and logistics, so on and so forth. I think what's really interesting from this slide too is 2018, 2019, over 40% of respondents were reporting no cover. 0% of their financial impact from a supply chain disruption was insured. Interesting that that's decreased in 2020 during the pandemic, and you can see that some levels of protection, insurance protection, I should say, have increased. But overall, risk transfer is not meeting the full needs of the market, and there are some issues there which we're going to go on to talk through. The first point I think we've covered. 3/4 of organisations reporting partial or full coverage. 1/3 of respondents suggesting the market doesn't supply tailored products. I guess that's probably fairly common sense in the time of a pandemic. Organisations left without cover. Now, what I would say about this is you would all be aware that some of these matters are going through the courts. And when we're thinking about any questions that we might like to discuss at the end of this, I couldn't do justice to answering those questions at the time. I'm not an underwriter. I'm not conversant on policy coverage and response. So I just couldn't do justice to those. So if any of these questions, maybe we'll take them offline and Zurich would be happy to answer them at a later time. What I would like to focus on is how insurers are responding to supply chain issues. And if I think about my own company, Zurich, we now have what's called a capacity deployment model in the property space. Insurers are reducing capacity. They have concerns about accumulation. So we have responded with a deployment model. And we're prioritising customers that can demonstrate maturity in their supply chain. They can demonstrate business resilience and that they're thinking or using about AI, artificial intelligence enabled early warning systems. So how does this work? For an underwriter to deploy capacity, they need insights on the insured or potential insureds' supply chain maturity. So a risk engineer like myself, instead of going out and doing the traditional, let's go and look at your fire sprinklers, we're now talking to our customers about their organisational maturity, their supply chain risk management framework, the business continuity arrangements. We're doing supplier criticality assessments. An example of this, we've had one customer recently where we have done site assessments on their suppliers, not the organisation we insure, but their suppliers, because our insured and our underwriters needed a level of comfort. We're thinking about natural hazards, natural perils, cyber, and we're bringing all of this together to give these insights to our underwriters so that they can make decisions, informed decisions about where they deploy their capacity. And the challenge for the organisation, the insured, is how can they unlock that capacity if they haven't done the homework, if they haven't mapped their supply chain, if they haven't looked at all tiers of their supply chain, if they haven't looked at the business continuity management put in place by suppliers. And I'm just going to refer to my notes here because this is really important. In the BCI report for 2020, only 32.5% of respondents had looked at the business continuity management framework of all Tier 1 suppliers, only 32.5%. When it comes to Tier 4 and beyond, it's down to 10%. So the question for business is, if risk transfer is an important part of your risk management framework, how are you going to unlock that capacity if you haven't done the homework to give the underwriters the comfort they need? So there's some of the challenges that are facing all of us in respect to the insurance markets and obtaining coverage at this time. And it's not just property damage, it's cyber and all of these other policies. And I think we'd all be aware of the issues in the cyber markets at the moment. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to shift. We need to shift from this procurement as a function model with the characteristics on the left-hand side, the passive, the reactive. We need to shift to this risk-aware, digitally proactive supply chain risk management model, where an organisation can demonstrate maturity to itself, to its suppliers, to its stakeholders, and to its insurers. And it has to be supported by new technology, big data, artificial intelligence, enabling full tier visibility and transparency. And of course, the AI, that's about filtering out the noise. And it is about creating trust and transparency through the whole supply chain. And as I said, it's about reducing that latency in response. And there are 4 elements to this, as I've alluded to. Understanding the status quo, and we're not going to go through the ISO 31000 framework. You'll all be conversant in that. You'll know it inside out. But it is understanding the status quo, what your risk appetite is, establish the context, all of those other elements, build out the strategy, scale it up to have a best-in-class supply chain risk management framework. That shift from procurement as a function that focuses on cost saving, and then use that system to scale up to create value for all of the stakeholders. So what could this model look like? This is one model, and there will be many others, and I fully understand that. I fully understand that. But this is a model that looks at fusing supply chain risk management, elevating it from procurement to create a supply chain risk management model that sits at the very top of the business, so that every bit of information, every decision is available and taken in light of supply chain business and revenue risk. It's not about cost management anymore. The old procurement model of we've saved you 50 cents on each widget doesn't hold for the current time or for the future. And so the 5 elements there are really, quite logical when you think about that. A centre of excellence for supply chain risk management. Institutionalise it throughout the organisation. Integrate the governance model into the structures. Data, state-of-the-art digital solution. Education, full-scale change and communication. And if you think about those 4 steps that I spoke to, we can align these. Understand the status quo, that's the short term. Build out the risk management strategy, that's the mid-term. Scale it up in the longer term, and overall create and deliver value for all of those stakeholders. Let's move on. How do we break down this supply chain model? You can't just pull out each one of these little pieces of the pie. It's, for use of a better term, holistic. Every one of these things needs to be built out if we're going to change from a procurement as a function, cost-saving department to a risk management framework. Now, we've highlighted digital solutions there in the dark blue, and I think it's fair to say that I could also consider a digital solution, AI, as being a method or a tool. And it does fit in that little slice there. But the future of supply chain is going to be AI, and it is going to be predictive techniques and technology, and therefore it warrants its own little slice all on its own. So again, the key point here, this is a risk management framework mapped to the lowest level of supplier, tier 4 and beyond. It improves the transparency, the visibility, the flexibility. It'll allow an organisation to predict supply chain instability or disruption and respond. It's a shift from the procurement model. We're not going to talk to this slide in any great depth, but when I looked through it, when I looked through these 7 steps to secure a supply chain, the one that popped out to me was number 4, calculate the revenue flow exposure. So it's no longer good enough to think about procurement achieving savings, or procurement has got an increasing quality on the product, or procurement has brought forward delivery on time. It's about calculating the revenue flows and the exposure to the business. And then I realised there was a trap in this. Calculate the revenue flow exposure. And if we don't think through this deeply, we can do that on a product. But we need to think about the revenue flow exposure from all risks, not just procurement. The reputational, the legal, the HSE, all of those other risk elements. And I'll give you an example. Boohoo, a UK clothing manufacturer, suffered a 1 billion hit on the share market some years ago when there was an article in the paper about a clothing supplier that was linked to them. Revenue, business exposure. Don't just think about it as the commodity, the product. Can we get hit by a reputational issue? How do we calculate the revenue flow that we could lose from that hit, as opposed to the old procurement model of what happens if we can't get this part on time? So let's think about how digital can support that risk management framework. I'm not surprised that near 60% of organisations have increased the use of technology to map supply chain disruption as a direct result of COVID-19. That's no surprise to me. We're all humans and we all react. What does surprise me, as I mentioned earlier, is that near 60% of organisations aren't mapping their supply chain through the tiers. They're not modelling the consequences, the probability. They're not looking deeply at those business continuity arrangements in place. So there's a long way to go. And again, come back to complex, challenging, interconnected, lack of visibility, inability to predict, and if they can't establish maturity, they may have insurance capacity issues. And technology can help them do this. Technology can help them do all of this. And the future of technology in this supply chain space is, as I've mentioned, the digital supply network. So let's have a look at the characteristics of what the future holds for all of us in this space. Powered by artificial intelligence, identifying threats, analysing impacts and mitigating risks. Now, these categories here, I think they'd be fairly self-explanatory to most people. But typically, in any organisation, digital systems technology is used for that organisation. It does not connect with all of the supplier nodes, the warehouse nodes, the other service supplier nodes. So the shift in technology is really about bringing all stakeholders in. One system, one technological solution with all of these nodes supplying real-time information. That's where the trust issue comes. I acknowledge that. But this is the future of the digital supply network. And Deloitte gives some great insights into what it looks like. It's always on. It's pulling traditional data sets and new data sets. It's using artificial intelligence sensors, location-based detectors, and it's providing the right time information in real time. As I said, it's this connected community, suppliers, customers, the manufacturer, all connected. That's a real step change. Everyone in the one data system. It's like the big Internet of Things where my fridge can order a litre of milk. Well, now, organisations like Tesco are using technology to balance supply and demand with their producers. And I'll give you an example. Tesco is taking UK Bureau of Meteorology data, using artificial intelligence to do whatever they need to do with it, and feeding that to its suppliers. So when they predict, for example, that there's a hot spell coming in 2 weeks' time, that data automatically goes through to the supplier, and the supplier ramps up its production of ice cream. And that's fed back to the Tesco stores. They match and balance supply and demand using artificial intelligence. What does this mean? A Tesco store is never going to miss a sale on an ice cream in a hot spell. That's competitive advantage. End-to-end transparency, I've already mentioned that. And information breaks down the silos. So the systems that are here today and are coming, artificial intelligence can identify a risk, analyse the impact to a business, and feed the humans with solutions. Take out all of the guesswork, all of the latency, all of the time lag. Artificial intelligence can give you a solution to a problem you didn't even know you had whilst you were asleep. Let's have a look at how that part of a digital network solution can help an organisation. AI mapping and warning. Now, this is a screenshot from a Zurich partner that I mentioned before, Risk Methods. And this is the mapping component of their system. It's called a risk radar. It maps all of those nodes, the suppliers, the customers, the supply path, their own sites, countries. It maps all of it. And what happens is, if you have a location in Melbourne, for example, and there is a power outage, it will send an alert to say your site in Melbourne has been impacted by a major power outage in Melbourne. There's your warning. But it goes further than that. Dependent on the amount of information that business puts into this, and let's go back to, we need to understand the supply chain, we need to map the supply chain, we need to think about the business continuity arrangements through the suppliers, through all of those tiers. If a mature organisation wants to input that data into a system, artificial intelligence can assess the impact of that power outage on that manufacturing plant in Melbourne. And it can then provide predictive responses back to the customer to say, your plant in Melbourne is out, and you might need to ramp up production in your plant in Sydney. Oh, and by the way, we've just had a new warning which says the Hume Highway is closed. So you might want to think about taking an inland route to manage your logistics. So what you're seeing here is these warning systems, these impact assessment systems, these predictive analysis systems, all powered by artificial intelligence based on the data that is put into them. And let's never forget rubbish in, rubbish out. The organisation has to do the homework. It has to do the homework up front. Otherwise, you won't be putting the right information into a system like this. They're filtering out the noise. They're creating the visibility, and they're giving AI-enabled flexible responses. And that's where the information silos start to break down. You get better organizational thinking, and that information can be fed not just to the customer, it can go through to the supplier as well. So our plant in Melbourne is down. You're our supplier in Adelaide. We want you to immediately ramp up your supply. This is the future. It's here now, and there will be a take-up on it. But this is what this sort of identification, assessment, and response system can do. Now, as I said, it's a component, just like risk transfer. It's part of an overall digital network solution, and a digital network solution is part of a supply chain risk management framework. But I hope you can start to see how pulling together all of these elements would allow an organisation to shift from procurement as a function, cost saving, to a level of maturity that they could demonstrate to all stakeholders, their shareholders, their insurers, all of those other organisations. If you can demonstrate a level of maturity, does this not put you in a better place to win a contract? This is all about building competitive advantage, creating value in what's a really complicated, challenging environment. So that's where AI mapping and warning systems are. And they're here today, they're with us, and there are a number of these products available today. This is not an advert for a Zurich supplier. There's many of them out there, but you need to understand what you're putting into the model in order to understand what you're going to get out of the model. Now let's have a look at how this can work. A practical example. So these are excerpts of warnings generated in relation to the semiconductor industry. And you'll see a number of them there. Pandemic, revenue and outlook warning, strikes in Italy, impacted ACE manufacturer, Europe's largest manufacturer of semiconductors. Then we come through to the middle in June, component bottlenecks reported by ASA, and so on and so forth. So these are the warnings that an insured or a customer would get from one of these radar systems. Now, if you just take this model, this component of the system, all you get is the warning. You then have to revert to whatever you have in place manually or through your own business continuity arrangements to manage that potential interruption. All you're getting here is early warning. As I said, the next module in these systems is the business impact analysis. So AI will then say, you're going to be impacted by the fire at the plant in China in September, and it's going to hit your revenue here, or it's going to have this impact on this part of your business, or whatever the case may be. It will do the impact assessment for you, AI enabled. And then if you take out that third module, it will mitigate it. Okay, so here's the warning, here's the impact. Now, instead of buying your components from the plant in China, you need to go back to your alternative supplier in France and get onto them and order semiconductors. So I hope you can see how the three components each do a separate function, but they're all linked. And I'll give you an example of how this works. Stockmeyer, a European chemical manufacturer, uses this system, and they received 30 hours advance warning. Now, organisations like this trawl hundreds of data sites for information, be it the news or all their other sources. Hundreds of sites, AI pulling information into a tool like RithMethods and then providing these warnings. All done by AI, not by the human. Stockmeyer received 30 hours advance notification of a fire at a Shell plant in Europe. Shell provided a base chemical to Stockmeyer. In that 30-hour period, Stockmeyer was able to source that base chemical from another supplier, took a risk because it was only an advance warning. It took a risk. It engaged the other supplier. It saved €260,000 on that stock and secured its supply throughout the Shell outage. 30 hours advance notice before Shell declared force majeure. It had all of that in play. It had the inside running. Linde, an American company, construction company, they received 30-day warnings around a supplier that was teetering towards insolvency. They retrieved $70,000 worth of stock from the supplier. That was not claimed by the insolvency practitioner. And in that 30-day period, they were able to set up an in-house alternative, meaning they had no interruption to their business when the supplier went into administration 30 days later. So you can see here, and I hope you can see here, how the digital network solution opens up the visibility and it opens up the opportunity to respond flexibly in this really complex and challenging world. So let's wrap it all up. What does a resilient supply chain organisation look like? Well, they demonstrate a level of supply chain maturity. They elevate procurement as a function to a supply chain risk management framework that sits at the heart of their organisational thinking. It's not just another risk area. Every decision considers supply chain. It embraces digital. These organisations are 2 times more likely to prioritise digitalisation in their day-to-day operations. They filter the noise. They're 3 times more likely to have higher visibility into their suppliers. And they're talking with their suppliers and they're looking at the business continuity arrangements that the suppliers have in place. And they're 7 times, this is stark, 7 times more likely to expand their supply base in response to identifying a supply side vulnerability. They're managing their risks, they're spreading their risk, 7 times more likely. So in summation, what we see here is there's a real shift in the world at the moment. It's coming, it's here now, but it's no longer about procurement, it's about supply chain maturity. Insurers are looking for it. There needs to be a digital response. There needs to be a visibility response, and we all need to be thinking about how we can flexibly respond based on those other parameters that we've spoken about today. And with that, thank you very much. I hope you've had some value out of the session, and I look forward to any questions that you have.
Thank you, Simon. That was a fantastic presentation. So many elements to that. I'm sure everyone is digesting it and trying to distill it into a couple of questions. While we wait for those to come through, I've got a couple of questions myself, if you don't mind. We've seen a lot of change recently, particularly with the Modern Slavery Act coming into play in Australia, and we also have various other requirements around anti-bribery and corruption, and the impact of sanctions, particularly on our insurances and our banking facilities. How do you see those kind of requirements, particularly the modern slavery, because that's a fairly new addition with the Act coming into play in the last couple of years? And various other countries also have the same requirements. How do you see that kind of compliance element into play with the technology and the transparency that you talked about in the supply chain?
Katie, that's a really interesting question. And my thinking around this goes to organisations are siloed. So modern slavery, these other regulatory issues may well be considered by the legal department or the compliance department. It's not my area of expertise, so just bear with me on this. Then we have the procurement department, and they may use something like SAP, which manages their stock, and you can bolt on a maintenance program and all the rest of this. But these 2 things probably function in isolation in an organisation. Would the person down in the factory in the warehouse ever know about the Modern Slavery Act and vice versa? No. But these digital supply networks are coming or are here now. They're pulling all of this sort of risk data into the one system. So it's no longer the legal and compliance database and the SAP stock management system and the SAP HR system. They all plug into this DNS, the heart, and that provides visibility to all of the stakeholders. Does that go some way to answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It seems like there's a real opportunity there to combine those requirements that we all have in our supply chains now, the downstream requirements into that digital model using AI. And yeah, absolutely. Seems to be a real opportunity for companies to combine those into using the force of technology.
I think it is. And look, it's also really challenging. I mean, as I mentioned, earlier in the session, when I was talking about blockchain, I don't understand blockchain. I don't understand how these things can help. But I think there really is an opportunity for organisations to think about how they pull all of this data together. When I go out on site visits very often, and I talk to the production manager or the warehouse manager, whatever the case may be, and I say, well, you've got 7 days raw material here in your warehouse. What happens if your supplier can't deliver? And the answer is, oh, I don't know. I just make the stuff. Or I work for the maintenance department. So this is where all of these silos need to be broken down, and digital solutions can aid that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you gave us a huge amount of information in that presentations, and I think a lot of companies, as you said, and some of the stats were stark in that respect, are on kind of different levels of maturity when it comes to this area. What advice would you give those that are in the early stages? Where do you start?
I think where you start is an honest look at your business and say, in terms of supply chain risk management, where are we now? What's the status quo? So if it's like anything in life, if you understand where you are today and you understand where you want to be in a year's time or 2 years, whatever the case may be, you can then plug that gap. But the first step in this is getting the right people in the organisation together and having that honest conversation in terms of our supply chain. Are we procurement as a function, or what do we honestly think about our level of maturity? And of course, draw on those around you. Organisations like Zurich are now advising their customers, and there'll be many other customer consultants and so on and so forth out there. So just that honest conversation, where am I today, and what state do I need to get to, and who do I need to draw on to get there?
Yeah, that's a good idea, isn't it, to draw on that expertise that comes from, the likes of Zurich, because quite often improvements within companies are driven by insurers and various other bodies. So definitely drawing on the expertise there is critical. We've got 4 minutes to go. What do you see, just another quick question if you don't mind, you talked about the competitive advantage and various other things. If a lot of companies manufacturers would sit midway in other supply chains, so not everyone is at the end point, everyone sits at various spots along the way, particularly manufacturers. How do you see them how much do you see them integrating with the endpoint supply chain frameworks? And is there more of an opportunity for collaboration and kind of risk sharing and data sharing in that respect? When you talked about increased trust and transparency.
So if I was an intermediate manufacturer in this process, I was, say, in tier 2 or tier 3, ultimately feeding up to a customer. How would I think about this? If I can demonstrate the maturity in my own business, if I can demonstrate that I can handle shocks as they come along and that I can manage all of these disruptions, ultimately, does that not make me more valuable to my customer and to potentially new customers? So I think it flows in all directions. Understanding this shift from procurement. And a tier 2 or 3 supplier, they may well have procurement as a function. Are they really mature in this area as well? So I get your point, but I just think at all levels, at all nodes and tiers throughout this whole process, everyone needs to be thinking about how they can do this, and everyone needs to be thinking about how willing they are to trust and show transparency to their own suppliers and customers. And that one, I think that's the real challenge.
Yeah, as you said, thinking of it as a competitive advantage is
So
mindset.
So how do I create a competitive advantage, demonstrate trust and transparency with my customer, but at the same time not give away my intellectual property?
Yeah.
I'm not proposing a solution here. I'm possibly throwing up more challenges and complications, but it's a really interesting thought when you look at what organisations are talking about, be it Risk Methods or Deloitte, about these digital networks and how they increase trust and transparency. In some ways, they're asking every organisation to share everything about itself. That's a challenge.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Simon. We might wrap up there. That was a